All this week we've been celebrating the return of one of my favorite video game franchises of all time, Ghosts N Goblins. With 6 installments and 2 different spin-off series, there's a lot of history to cover. In an effort to finally put a cap on a week full of ghouls, goblins, and ghosts, I thought it might be fun to see what the critics said at the time. I'm specifically talking about Electronic Gaming Monthly, the classic magazine that ended up reviewing pretty much every game Capcom released between 1989 and 2009. Today, we're gonna crunch some of those numbers and do our best to not turn into a duck when we see how Electronic Gaming Monthly ranks the Ghosts N Goblinsverse. And don't worry, you're not gonna have to watch the video twice to see the real ending. As we begin our countdown, it's important to remember the Electronic Gaming Monthly loved Ghouls N Ghosts. Most of the games from the early 1990s received insanely high scores, with one even earning the coveted title of EGM's Game of the Year. However, by 2006, Sir Arthur's armor was starting to rust. The days of super tough arcade games had been replaced by a new generation of first-person shooters with convenient checkpoints. The writing was on the wall. This style of frustration was out of step with the rest of the industry. And that's reflected in the low scores for Ultimate Ghouls N Ghosts on the PlayStation Portable. Retronauts host Jeremy hated the new game so much that he ended up calling it the worst thing to happen to him all month. Ultimate put me in touch with my emotions too. I wept a little every time I came across one of the game's sporadic good ideas. Heartbroken that it was wasted on such a lousy update to an arcade classic. Giving it a 7.5 out of 10, Mark liked it a lot more than Jeremy, though he did complain about the cheap deaths. He made the argument that you should stick with this challenging side-scroller because you might even come to appreciate its toughness. Although the editors praised the sharp visuals and old-fashioned gameplay, they ended up giving Ultimate Ghosts N Goblins a series low average of 6 out of 10. When Maximo first debuted in 2002, the critics loved it. They thought it was a charming reimagination that pumped new life into an aging franchise. Unfortunately, they were not as charitable to the sequel, Maximo vs. Army of Zin. Yeah, it's no coincidence that the second most recent game is also the second worst, as the writing was on the wall that EGM's love affair with the Ghouls N Ghosts was definitely on the rocks. The franchise had strayed too far from the original formula, and the goodwill built up from the earlier games was starting to wear thin. Crispin sums it up perfectly. Call me nutty, but I thought sequels were supposed to improve on the games that preceded them. You know, offer souped-up weapons, tweaked gameplay, new moves, yada yada. Army of Zin just doesn't do the job. Mark gave the highest score of the bunch, noting that the annoying and numerous tricky jumping bits from the original had been vastly improved in the sequel. He also pushed back when it came to the new attacks, which kept him happily mashing buttons. Zin is old school in many ways, and it lacks a feature or gimmick that really stands out. But this is a solid entry in a genre that action platformer fans will definitely find worth checking out. With everybody being a little bit disappointed, Maximo vs. Army of Zin averages a frustrating 6.3 out of 10. Seeing as the original Ghosts N Goblins was released back in 1986, Electronic Gaming Monthly never got around to reviewing the Nintendo Entertainment System Classic. Thankfully, they were there when Capcom decided to re-release the game on the Game Boy Color in 2000. For American gamers, this is their first time to replay the classic game on new hardware. And let me tell you, the timing couldn't be more perfect. It was right there in the lull between Sir Arthur's side-scrolling trilogy and Maximo's 3D reinvention. So it was a nice reminder of why people continued to love the franchise even 15 years later. Unfortunately, we're never gonna find out what EGM thought of the original NES conversion. But you know, this Game Boy Color port does give us a slight indication. We don't really need to tell you that this game is hella fun to play. You should know. After all, Ghosts N Goblins is a classic. Sure, the gameplay is a tad simple and the graphics and sound are dated, but overall, it's a lot of fun, even on the little screen. It'll bring back all those warm, fuzzy memories of the good old days. Besides, it's better than most Game Boy platformers. Ooh, even after 11 years, EGM never missed an opportunity to dunk on the Game Boy. With a score of 7 out of 10, this Ghosts N Goblins port finds itself right in the middle of the pack, where it should be. After seeing the response of both fans and critics to Ghosts N Goblins and then Ghouls N Ghosts, Capcom decided to create a spin-off starring everybody's favorite gargoyle, Firebrand. The only problem is that Electronic Gaming Monthly neglected to review Gargoyle's Quest in 1990, making it one of the only Ghosts N Goblinsverse games to not get a proper review crew write-up. The good news is that they didn't make the same mistake 2 years later with Gargoyle's Quest 2 on the Nintendo Entertainment System. This was an action role-playing game that built on the foundation of the original, and it really took the franchise in a new and creative direction. Now, when it came to the reviews, Electronic Gaming Monthly was a little mixed on the Gargoyle's Quest series. They liked the horror-themed world and unique gameplay, but felt that it was a step down from the flagship series. Steve explained that he always liked the Ghouls N Ghosts games as well as the Game Boy spin-off, so naturally he's into Gargoyle's Quest 2. The division of role-playing and action is well done, and neither type of game is overly difficult. This is a great game for those die-hard action buffs who might be interested in giving an RPG a try. Ed not only gave the game a higher score, but is also one of the only critics to actually give specifics. A brilliant idea that'll appeal to both types of players. Filled with good graphics and decent sound, this is one sequel that was worth making. Ed's high score was enough to raise the average to a 7.25 out of 10. Landing Gargoyle's Quest 2 at the number 6 spot. As Sega launched their 16-bit Genesis around the world, they were also trying to play a careful balancing act with their 8-bit Master System. It seemed like any time they had a big 16-bit exclusive, they would almost immediately release a smaller, stripped-down version for the 8-bit market. Two of the most obvious examples of this was the Master System version of Altered Beast and Strider. But I'm here to say that their best downgraded port was actually Ghouls N Ghosts, a surprisingly accurate and smooth-playing version of the arcade hit. We'll end up talking more about the 16-bit version later on in this countdown, but first we need to address the Master System game, which debuted in 1990 to mostly positive reviews. Martin was impressed. I never thought Sega would actually shrink the awesome Genesis game into a 2-meg, 8-bit cart and come out with something decent. Of course, the graphics are toned down, but the play remains intact. Sushi X, on the other hand, wasn't as high on the game, but still applauded the port. This 8-bit version of Ghouls N Ghosts was really great. The gameplay is a little rough, there's a lot of flicker, and it does slow down. Otherwise, the graphics are great and more than make up for the lack of detailed backgrounds. It doesn't compare to the 16-bit version, but it's still good. And that's the problem. This version of Ghouls N Ghosts was competing against a year-old version that was better in every conceivable way. Still, for gamers who hadn't upgraded to 16-bit, this Master System version was a solid release that averaged a strong 7.5 out of 10. After conquering both the Game Boy and Nintendo Entertainment System, Firebrand only had one place left to go, and that is to the Super NES. Demon's Crest was not only a big step up from the previous two outings, but it was also a more focused adventure with better action and some of the best boss fights found in the entire Ghosts N Goblinsverse. Now, personally speaking, I would argue that this is more than just a great sequel, because it's also one of Capcom's very best 16-bit games. Sadly, even with the great graphics and amazing bosses, this game, and the whole spin-off series in general, didn't catch on in the same way as Ghouls N Ghosts. As a result, this ended up being the end of the line for Firebrand's epic journey. You can almost see the cult classic status being formed in real time when you read EGM's reviews. Ed began his review by noting that Demon's Crest will probably be one of those sleeper games, similar to how the Game Boy Gargoyle's Quest was. The graphics are beautiful and the gameplay is top-notch. You would do well to try this one out. You might be surprised. Al was certainly surprised by one aspect of the game. What I didn't expect was how big this game is. I love the fact that there are multiple endings. The different attacks are great too. I like this game. With an average score of 8.25 out of 10, Firebrand definitely went out on a high note. After wowing everybody with a critically acclaimed trilogy and then following that up with a well-received spin-off series, many gamers wondered where Capcom would take the franchise next. As it turns out, the answer was the Wonder Swan. Yeah, Sir Arthur's next adventure was a game called Maximo for Wonder Swan, an obscure installment that never made its way outside of Japan. However, 3 years after that admittedly awesome black and white adventure, the Ghouls N Ghosts went 3D in a next-generation reboot called Maximo, Ghosts to Glory. It starred a different hero, had a different story, and wasn't really connected to the other games. But you know what? It did share some of the same enemies, and when you got hit, you stripped down to your boxer shorts. So as far as I'm concerned, it's close enough. Crispin was thoroughly impressed with this unofficial sequel and called it one hell of a game. No huge go-anywhere worlds or collect-em-all crap here. Maximo just dishes out a good old time. Jonathan was also impressed, but for a completely different reason. It's rare to see a 2D to 3D conversion that isn't a pathetic hack job these days. So I was busting out of my heart-patterned boxers for Maximo. All 3 editors liked the challenge, the level designs, and the length. With a score of 8.5 out of 10, Maximo Ghosts to Glory managed to top even a fan favorite like Demon's Crest. If you've gone through our previous EGM shows, then you already know that Steve, Ed, and the whole rest of the review crew adored Ghouls N Ghosts. This was the first must-own game for the Genesis, proving once and for all that Sega's 16-bitter was the king of arcade conversions. In fact, the game proved to be so good that EGM ended up naming it their Game of the Year in their 5th issue, as well as calling it the best sequel to an existing game, best graphics in a video game, coolest boss attackers, and, just to balance things out a little bit, the worst stomach problems in a game. We did a whole award show episode where we go over all of these categories in greater detail. You should check it out. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we first need to go back and see what the EGM critics actually said. I mean, we know that they loved it, but how much? To answer that question, let's see how Ed starts his review. Ghouls N Ghosts is easily the best cartridge game ever made. Also, powerful, with audio that is second to none and animated backgrounds that add a great 3D effect. Combined with extremely challenging play, Ghouls is a superior effort. Steve agreed, concluding that Ghouls N Ghosts is just what a 16-bit game should be. It's one of the few titles that packs enough action and challenge to keep any player busy. The gameplay is great, the bosses are truly frightening, and the power-ups are different and exciting. With an average score of 9 out of 10 and a Game of the Year prize under its belt, you would think that Ghouls N Ghosts would be a shoo-in for the top spot. But you know, there is one game that the editors liked even more than this Genesis classic, and I think you know what it is. Although it may have been overshadowed by the likes of Mario and Sonic, Super Ghouls N Ghosts tops the list as Electronic Gaming Monthly's best reviewed Ghosts N Goblins game with a ghoulishly high score of 9 out of 10. But wait, hang on. Isn't that literally the exact same score that the Genesis version of Ghouls N Ghosts got? And didn't that go on to win a whole bunch of awards? In what universe can a game like Super Ghouls N Ghosts top all that? As it turns out, the answer to all of these questions lies in the magazine's 100th issue, published a few years later in November 1997. You see, that was the issue when EGM named the 100 best games of all time. A helpful little guide that I've used many times to break ties just like this. In that list, EGM named Ghouls N Ghosts the 47th best game of all time, beating out heavy hitters like Military Madness at 48, Mario Kart 64 at 49, and a personal favorite of mine, Devil's Crush at 50. One game that it did not beat out? Yeah, Super Ghouls N Ghosts, which landed 25 spots higher at number 22, wedged right between our Type 3 and Final Fantasy VII. You also saw the preference in the reviews. Resident Fake Ninja Sushi X flat out says that the Super NES sequel is definitely the best version of Ghouls N Ghosts to date, with plenty of action, options, power-ups, and wicked bosses. Martin agreed. I never thought that I would look back and think that the Genesis version of Ghouls N Ghosts was cheesy. After playing this cart from beginning to end, the difference is like NES and Genesis. Yeah, I wouldn't go that far, but I agree with all the critics who called the game awesome. Even with the recent sequels and reboots, I would argue that this 16-bit classic remains the best looking game in the whole Ghosts N Goblinsverse. With an average score of 9 out of 10, as well as a higher spot on the top 100 list, Super Ghouls N Ghosts earns the title as Electronic Gaming Monthly's best reviewed Ghosts N Goblins game. Yeah, not bad for a 30-year-old sequel. Hey, thanks for watching EGM Ranks Ghosts N Goblins. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is your favorite game from the Ghosts N Goblinsverse? Also, do you think that EGM got their ranking right? Let me see your thoughts and picks in the comments below. Also, I don't normally do this, but if you know somebody who loves Ghosts N Goblins, old magazines, or just clicking on random videos, then please, do me a favor and let them know about this episode. Man, I spent a lot of time researching and putting together these magazine best and worst episodes, and I would love for them to find some sort of audience. We'll be back next week with more reviews and who knows, maybe even more magazine coverage. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,